While people are taking their seats, we give a little short introduction. So this is the second of a series that we're now rolling out globally on issues that we think are highly pertinent to the industry. We started this in San Francisco at WebScale, where the topic was smart energy. That becomes a topic that we take elsewhere in the world in 2018. And today, obviously, it's about the edge and what it is we mean by the edge. And I have only one statement to make about this. And that is what we consider to be digital transformation and what we consider to be the technology and capability sets that comprise digital transformation all take place at the edge. I'm sure that I'm not thinking of something, but that's really where the rubber meets the road. So what we're here to do today is talk about kind of two frameworks for the edge. One is where we are today, what is the present state, what are the capabilities that are now required, and forecasting into the future to 2025 and beyond, what's happening. So by my calculation, we went from 1.1 zettabyte of data 2 years ago. We'll end this year at 4.4 zettabytes globally. We'll get to 2025 having blown right by 75 zettabytes. And I'm not sure I care whether anyone argues with me about that. It is just exponential growth every year for the near future. And most of the impact of that is going to be felt at the edge, and the edge is driving most of it, is the engine for it. So without any further ado, I want to welcome Tom Humphrey, Schneider Electric, lead on the industrial IoT and the edge for Schneider. And he's going to be followed by Caroline Chan from Intel, who is responsible for edge infrastructure, IoT, 5G mobility at Intel. So 1, 2, you will go on without further introduction. And by the way, this is a very informal afternoon. This is mix it up. If we had food, we'd probably throw it. We want you to be actively engaged. We're missing a microphone over here, but there are going to be 2 mics in the room. And the idea is to have as much time as possible for not just Q&A, but fervent opinion. So, Tom.
Thank you, Bruce. Oh, there it is. Well, welcome, and thank you all for being here on behalf of Schneider Electric. We're really excited to have some panelists on some of the different forums, to be fortunate enough to be presenting here. And Bruce asked me to talk a little bit about edge computing, IoT. There's tons of names that people are calling edge, and really kind of depending on the perspective of either the user or the designer, it's viewed very differently. So when we say edge, it's kind of an all-encompassing term. But within Schneider, we look at edge as kind of like a regional edge. We've got telco edge, wireless and wired telco edge. And we have the local edge, which is really more that kind of rack-based infrastructure. And then we have the industrial edge, right? That's kind of how we break it up. And all of these edges kind of combine with the cloud to create this hybrid environment of the modern computing infrastructure, and some people are optimizing it for cloud versus edge and all that. So we're going to talk a little about why are people doing this, like what's driving this edge topology, if you will, and hopefully you'll find it insightful, and I will go from there. So the first thing I want to bring up is, one of Schneider Electric's brand promises is certainty in a connected world. So we see edge as a great opportunity because as these edge applications become more critical to business, obviously we see it as an opportunity for resiliency and things that we typically would go to market with, but it's a much bigger story than that. It's really about what it's doing, as Bruce mentioned, for digital transformation. What does that mean for businesses? Companies historically have always said we have to focus on our core competency, and really edge and the applications that the edge is capable of supporting is pushing people even outside their core competency and saying, hey, we have an opportunity to capitalize in this space because physically or geographically we're located here and we can take advantage of the edge to do X. And it may not be something they had done in the past. So it's actually very rich and interesting when you think about it that way. And if you talk about some of the technologies that are enabling edge, one is cloud computing. Really the growth of IoT, Internet of Things, and IIoT, Industrial Internet of Things. When you start saying, Internet of Things, I laugh because I'm an engineer and I think, I never thought I'd be talking on stage about the term things. But we're going to go into a little bit of that and why that is so important. In the compute space and the storage space, when you look at converged and hyper-converged infrastructure, then you say, okay, now I have this very dense, very powerful compute I can put out at the edge. So again, now people start thinking, what things could I do if I had storage and compute local, and I could really take advantage of that? And then I marry that with a cloud topology, and all of a sudden, wow, I've got tons of power at my fingertips, and I can manage where storage and compute happens and how much bandwidth I leverage. So it really has gotten to that bottom line, which is it's evolving business models of companies to say, if I leverage technology, does it give me an operational efficiency? Does it increase the customer experience? Does it allow me to drive higher customer sat? All different things. And then again, things that we never thought of. The whole idea of autonomous cars that we're hearing about now, and thinking about how is that going to change our future. And I was just reading an article about that, and it said car designers now have to think about how do they keep you entertained in your car, because you're just going to be sitting there while the car drives around, or do you have all the tools you need to do work? And I was actually thinking about it as I was driving to the airport this morning at 4 o'clock. You could actually have one of those recumbent bike things, and you could, do your workout on your way to work in your car, sitting in traffic, and read the news or catch up on work. So you can think of how this idea of, always on, always ready, high bandwidth compute and storage pretty much everywhere just changes how we will interact in so many ways. So that's very exciting. It's very complex. As we see here, right? There are lots of things. So what is the Internet of Things? And the way this slide breaks down is at the bottom you've got the building blocks, right? So you've got the technologies, the protocols, and then as you move up, you start going into more sophisticated layers of the platforms and enablement horizontal. So you've got things like software, connectivity, right? So as you start marrying up the stack into personal devices, lifestyle devices, connected home, and in that right quadrant is really the IIoT, right? Industries and industrial internet. So you start saying, okay, if all of these things are connected and interplaying together, what's going to happen? Well, Bruce also pointed out, right, huge amounts of data, right, just massive amounts of data. If you followed any of the, what the NSA and the CIA do, they've got a problem with they can collect all this data, but how do you actually go through and analyze that? And that's when you get things like Watson and supercomputers and say, how do we leverage technology to be able to just crunch this data to make something intelligent out of it? And that's really the core of it all, is as more and more things get connected, as more and more things are able to start communicating amongst themselves, now you start to say, okay, where's the power, right? What's going to drive the next intelligent idea or the next great business concept? And that's where businesses are putting a lot of people behind it and saying, how will we innovate with what we have, or how is what we do today going to change because of these technologies? And again, I'll have a few examples here, but IoT is creating more data. It's just natural. The more things you plug into the internet, so to speak, or on a network, you start to collect more data. This is an example of a box store, right? Picture any name brand box store, and you've got kind of your floor layout, you've got the stock room, you've got a restaurant down here, and you think, well, how would a store leverage technology, right? An edge technology. What would they put in that store to kind of enhance what they do? And off the top of my head, you think, okay, they've got a restaurant. Well, probably would be handy to know, does this restaurant actually drive more clients? Do people come into the restaurant and leave, or do they come in and they go into the store? And then once they go in the store, what do they do, right? So with motion detection sensors in the lights and whatnot, I can actually see, hey, if I have this banner over here and it flashes a certain message, does that drive traffic? And if I change the banner, does the traffic go up? Does it go down? If I'm moving stock of my RFID on my stock, I can automate, when I pull stuff out of the stockroom, repopulate, right? So now you start thinking, geez, everything in that store is connected. It's creating data, it's interacting digitally, and now do I have a mini data center there that does some of this compute and storage, or am I sending that all back, to home base? Well, think about that from a large chain where you have 4,000 branches, right? You start saying, well, that's going to be a massive amount of data. And I got to think about bandwidth. I got to think about what are my costs going back to the cloud, to my corporate data center. I think about, multiple branches, all, as you hear probably pretty much every day. We just heard about Equifax, right? Multiple points of vulnerability now, right? I have all these devices that are talking, a lot of them wirelessly. I've got people showing up in my store with their, smartphones and their iPads, and are they going to be hooking on to my Wi-Fi? Are they going to start getting access? So you start, again, as an IT manager, as a corporate entity that's saying, I want to provide this extreme level of service, but I've got to protect my core, right? I got to protect my network. I got to protect all my assets. So it becomes a very interesting paradigm that's happening today. But at the end of the day, if you look at it from a business perspective, from a retail perspective, what am I doing to the customer experience? Am I taking advantage of the fact that when they walk in my bricks and mortar store, I've got to get a share of the wallet, right? I've got to maximize my share of wallet. So I'm going to do everything I possibly can, and I'm going to leverage technology to do that. Because if I don't, they'll drive home, they'll go on Amazon, and they get shipped with 2-day shipping on Prime, and boom, they're happy, and they got what they wanted. If they walk in my store, I got to capitalize on that, right? I got to make that happen immediately. So I'm going to leverage technology as best I can. So we talk about new customer experiences. Personally, I'm going to use a little airline analogy here, but I use an airline app. A lot of people use their airline apps. And I become dependent on it, right? I love the fact that what I used to sit in front of somebody and they would click, 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 click all the keys, and I wonder how is it possible you click like 1,000 keystrokes to print my ticket out? But I expect it to be interactive, integrated, mobile, timely, secure. I expect that I can get almost every interaction I need from my airline partner via my phone. I can check in, I get my boarding pass, I can look at what the in-flight entertainment is, right? I can do all those great things. The problem for the airline becomes once I'm hooked, that can never not work. Right? And that's what IoT is becoming, is once we start to rely on that technology or become comfortable with it, or it provides us with an experience that we enjoy from a particular brand or company, we expect it, right? It's 100% available all the time. So you start thinking about, okay, as a business, what do I have to do to ensure that that experience continues, right? So when I look at my continuity, my business continuity plan, and it stretches now what I used to think of as, I gotta have this hardened 2N, fully redundant data center, I gotta look at the rest of my architecture and go, how far out of that do I have to extend that in order to provide that experience continuously for my customers? And then that starts to get our wheels turning and saying, well, what can we do to help solve those problems, right? Because some of the problems are going to be, what needs to stay on premise, what needs to go to the cloud? How do I optimize that infrastructure to say, what should I do locally? How do I maximize the opportunity I have with my bandwidth? Are any of my applications, you're hearing a lot today about machine-to-machine, artificial intelligence, do any of those have latency constraints where I have to do some of that compute because it's machine-to-machine and it's so fast, I don't have the time to go back to the cloud, right? How do I make that decision, right? There's got to be something out there that can help us do that. Increased physical network security risks. Again, this is, almost every day in the newspaper we're hearing something about a network security either breach or risk, or somebody that's saying, hey, I got the next greatest, network security device. Come talk to me. And then you think about the edge, as Bruce was saying, where this is happening in such a distributed environment now, where I could focus my assets on my core data center, or I would have, stuff consolidated into certain cloud or colo facilities. Now I've got it all over, as well as my cloud and my colo, right? So now I'm managing, I've got all these plates spinning, and I got to keep everything going, and I have to look at how all that interplay happens. So from a business perspective, it becomes a little bit complex, but it also becomes something that can really enable, and to some extent, I'm having to do it to keep up with my competitors. So I've got to learn how to do this, right? I got to figure out how to spin the plates, and I've got to leverage the experts, which hopefully you guys will learn from here today, on how do I do that. But again, new challenge creates new opportunities. So when we think about technologies enabling technology, right? So the next presenter coming up is going to talk about 5G, and you think about autonomous cars, right? And all the things, the airplanes, right? How much data they're creating. And you say, well, if I build a bigger pipe, somebody's going to build something that creates and leverages that pipe. And then in probably a couple of years, they'll be talking about 6G because that pipe won't be big enough for all the data that's being created with cars, and now they're talking trucks and all this, right? So you've got this kind of juxtaposition of things that, hey, I can take advantage of this 5G that's coming, but then I'm going to run out of that because I've got this bandwidth constraint where I'm trying to do the next big thing. And it's interesting how they keep kind of growing off of one another. I can remember my cell phone maybe 6-7 years ago could barely stream a video, right? I could almost not stream any. And nowadays, I mean, I can sit anywhere in the world pretty much and watch Hulu and see what the show that I'm watching right now. So it's a fascinating concept that you've got technologies enabling technology, not even in the aspects of AI where technology is actually creating its own languages and whatnot, but just the fact that something like increased bandwidth will allow somebody to develop something that will now take advantage of that bandwidth, and that will shift the whole paradigm again, right? We'll move into another space. Enhanced customer experiences is really a big one that I find fascinating, because when I think about myself as a consumer and I look at technology and how I consume it and what things that I can take advantage of, and it's different for different people, right? Some people are always on the bleeding edge and the cutting edge, and some people are kind of holdbacks, but in the end, we all kind of succumb to the convenience. And that's what's fascinating for me, is how things become that were so cutting edge in a very short amount of time become an expectation. And again, that goes into that whole people expect the performance. And the final piece that I see as huge, which is more of an IoT play, I would say, but I think you're going to see it across the enterprise even more, is this predictive analytics to optimize performance. And when we look at that at Schneider, we look at a building, and we look at the data center, and we look at the grid, and we say, if we can optimize across that entire spectrum, now you're really cooking with gas when you talk about creating efficiencies. And that's really where we see huge opportunity as a company to really drive across platforms that never used to talk before, and how do we kind of synergize that. So, one thing I've kind of stressed is our perception of failure today, or historically, has been adequate, because we look at it and say, hey, if this box doesn't work, we measure uptime in this box in the X amount of nines, or however you want to calculate that. But really what we're measuring is who's on the other end of that box, right? What's happening, and what's the experience that's being interrupted? And if that's interrupted, it doesn't matter if the box out, over here is still working, because that person can't get what they're trying to do, wherever they are. And it's typically, as Bruce pointed out, at the edge at this point, right? So how do we make sure that that entire ecosystem is able to support the process that we're driving? So from our perspective, if you look at where we've been historically, and Bruce did a great intro, is, we see this data platform, right? We see combining these worlds of the data center, the building, the industry, and the grid. And we say, if we took all of the characteristics as we consume energy, right, through those platforms, and we say, hey, if each of those platforms is smart and connected, it's going to be able to give us data. And from that data, we have some really smart people out there that can look at this, ones and zeros, and make sense of it, and say, if I take that and I add what's happening in the IT stack, I add what's happening in all the apps and my user information, I mean, the one I can think of the best is Amazon, right? They're so good at taking our data as consumers and using it for the benefit of their vendors, for the benefit of the consumer, right? It changes how we interact digitally in commerce. Same idea. We can take that data and get really rich insights from it and make much better decisions about how we consume energy, how we deploy the systems that consume energy, because we're going to be looking at them holistically instead of in kind of little pockets and bites. So again, the edge is creating all of these ideas of, if I've got access to this data, because it's all connected out here at the very end of my network, and when I pull it all back in and I do some really smart analytics on it, I'm going to become much better at what I do, or I should be able to. And it's really ultimately going to be probably one of the biggest differentiators moving forward, is who manages their data the best, right? Who can take what is happening from a physical environment, from their customer interactions, their customers' data, who can combine all that and get the rich insights that say, hey, if I move this here to here, I'm going to get some increased benefit, or if I do this instead of this for my customer, they like me more, and my brand grows, and I grow my revenues, right? So that's really where we see the data platform happening, and how do we do that, right? You've got to have things connected, and that's kind of a no-brainer today. There's not much being created today that doesn't plug in either Wi-Fi or via an RJ45. It's got to be And again, right there, right? It's not just Schneider, it's everybody, right? These platforms typically now have to be open because as much as we would love to say everybody buy our equipment, the reality of the world is people have brand preferences, they have reasons, they have history, they have legacy equipment. Let's make sure that these platforms are open and robust and can take these data points from mixed resources and still give us that rich information, because if you're just going to try to proprietarily do it, you're going to cut out a significant portion of the market. Edge control, right? So having things on-prem that can actually control things, right? So it's great that you've got this thing connected, but now can you actually interact with it? Like in a building, right? Can you move VAV boxes? Can you turn lights on and off when people leave? Can you, motorize shutters to take advantage of daylight harvesting? Like, can we make sure that we leverage the technology and actually physically control it when it's to our benefit? And then ultimately, once we start doing those two things, the data that happens, because we're now interacting with it, we're changing variables, we're seeing what those changes do, we apply smart apps and analytics over it, and all of a sudden, we've got this net new logic of how we look at what we do. And again, that's what I'm saying. Businesses are seeing opportunities where they didn't exist because they're getting information that didn't exist before, and they're making correlations and causalities, right? And looking at, if I do this, then this. And it's really fascinating when you start breaking down the processes that go behind it. And I think one of the biggest fields they're looking at right now are there's not enough good people to do the analytics, right? We can build all the stuff that creates it, but we need more and more smart people that can do the analytics. So it's becoming fascinating. Where we see it is for the end user customer, for ourselves, consumers, there's lots of benefits that we're going to get from the development of these technologies. Our channel partners and our resellers and all of our brand partners are seeing this as an opportunity to kind of transform themselves and become. We're seeing tons and tons of partners that have IoT practices now, right? Because they're seeing that you can't just be a one-trick pony. You kind of have to embrace what's happening out there. And then from an industry perspective, if you think about that stack and looking across the data center, the industry, the building, and the grid, and if you start doing that, you think about as a country and as a world, right? We at Schneider, we look at it as saying the amount of power in the world is going to double by 2050, and we need to cut CO2 emissions in half. Well, we're going to have to do that some way smarter than we've been doing it for the last 100 years, right? And this is going to help enable us and customers and people to do that. So we really are excited about the opportunity that the Edge brings. We think it's still in its infancy to some extent. We see opportunity continuing to grow and continuing to really change the business world from this digital transformation perspective. So we hope you find the panels really engaging and exciting, and I look forward to talking to some of you the rest of the week. I think Caroline's coming up to do the next piece. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So I am coming from Intel. So in Intel, I manage a 5G infrastructure team. So I'll focus a little bit about 5G and what 5G does to the edge, and what we're doing also, some of the learning we've done. So in terms of our 5G, I've been in the wireless industry for a long time. And in the previous generation of wireless, they tend to be very single-minded, meaning that it's either for 2G's for voice and 3G's start a little bit of data, 4G's data. 5G is really about business transformation because the way that 5G is designed such that it actually caters to 3 different purposes. One is enhanced mobile broadband. The other one is mission critical applications, like something like e-health and cloud robots. And the third one is a massively connected things. So for the first time, you see a wireless standards designed specifically, distinctively, and natively for all 3 things. It might seem to be so what? But in an engineering sense, it's actually really difficult because cloud data center, in the cloud side, we market to abundance. Oh, you need more things? Let me throw you another VM. For the wireless side, we market to scarcity, meaning that Spectrum, God doesn't make them anymore, so you got to use whatever you got and squeeze the most out of it. And when you are doing a single purpose design, it's much easier. You have Moore's law in silicon, we have Shannon's law. So at least when I was going to UT Austin, that was Shannon's law. So we're pushing the limit to that. Now, here's the tricky thing. Once you start talking about everything that Schneider lets you just talk about, connecting things, it's a total different dimension. You have to start designing natively things different in order to fit a smart city, fit a autonomous driving. The principles started changing. So that is really the first time when we talk about 5G, all of a sudden you talk about from a technology sense to business transformation sense. So lately I've been talking with a way broader ecosystem than I ever talked to. I just came back from IBC, International Broadcast Conference in Amsterdam, where people were talking about a VR. Intel was co-produced a Dunker VR trailer and a Spider-Man VR trailer, and they've been using it for advertisement. In reality, why couldn't you monetize it? And then the other things I just went to see an 8K video. I'm still haven't got my 4K video. They show an 8K video. It's amazing when you put 4K, 8K next to it, you go like, oh. It's really, I mean, every single pause that's showing up. So it's really amazing things that if you want to deliver this wirelessly, think about what does that mean. So in terms of jobs, this is like the things that the industry kept talking about. What are the market growth? So I came from NAV, SDN world market growth, and it really enhances a lot of it. But underlying all of this, if you look at, there's a really good white paper, by the way. Anybody can go download. It's called 5G Americas. It's a consortium formed by, I think, headlined by AT&T, but all the other operators in Americas are part of it. We're part of it. We have an analyst event coming up. There's a white paper on this, on what does it mean to 5G. Literally, the first paragraph said that 5G is going to be built on network function virtualization. What that really meant is that the network that carries all the wireless data needs to be more cloud-like. Well, that's our wheelhouse, right? That's the data center wheelhouse. All of a sudden, people in the network, in the far edge, and say, oh, our infrastructure should be more like the cloud guys. So now we are talking. So if you look at this, we start talking about cloud ready. Well, cloud has always been cloud ready, and software defined in terms of network. All of these really started putting a end-to-end structure together where we take some of the practice that's always been served us well in the cloud side and pushing that all the way to the edge. And I'll give you some examples. And some of the ecosystem guys actually sitting here so we can have a real good discussion. So within Intel, we said 5G extends the cloud to multi-access edge. That multi-access means there's wireless, that means Wi-Fi, means cable, Comcast, anyone, means wireline, Ethernet. The principle is when you start pushing smart server all the way to wherever you touch either the B2B or the B2C, you start getting some of the goodness of the smart that pushing out the smart city, connected car, gaming, healthcare, some of the caching, precision technology, and retail. I really like that retail. In fact, we are working on the retail ones. So if you talk about edge, where the edge ends. So this is an example, right? Crown Castle. A lot of the Crown Castle folks are here. Vapor.io, we work with them and looking at, look, what if a data center really put them on a cell tower? That's an amazing thing. You think about, how many Amazon data center they have. Well, there was rumor they bought the Whole Foods for that. Well, I don't know, but cell tower, there's plenty of them. In the US, it's like in the tens of thousands, 100,000s. In China, 1.6 million cell towers. Take that, Amazon, Google. It just really, if you truly can make that to be your edge, you put a server SKU on top of a network, a wireless network, that multiplier is amazing. I don't know if you would do that. It economically makes sense to do all of it, but the possibility, potentially, to put some of that up there, and in a combination of edge compute, there's words going around called network edge compute, MEC, or just edge compute. It's really about putting the cloud characteristics out there, whether it's with a wireless network or Wi-Fi network, but it's really about getting closer to the enterprise and to the consumers. Think about all the cars that we're driving around. Where are the cars gonna drive? They're gonna be driving on the roads. Well, what's the closest thing to them? It's cell towers. So this really makes sense, and this is something we wanted to experiment. As an industry, we got to push it out there to try this out and see what sticks. at this edge, it behooves us to try as many things as possible. To give you another example, we took this, and this happened to be I think it's ASU, because I think our graphic designer actually was as an alumni. Had been me, would have been UT Austin. But anyway, so when they were going through renovation, we participated in that. How do we put some of the server skills out there? What can we do with it, right? For Wi-Fi, LTE, whatever. If you have a neutral host means you serve. Put a small cell out there, host everybody, AT&T, whether you're AT&T or Verizon, subscribe, you can all work in there. But we play around with different things. And we took the learning from here. We went to Wembley Stadium. We partnered with BTEE and did a security experiment. So all of the cameras that the security personnel has, the facial recognition right away. We did edge and video rebroadcast. So every angle of a soccer game, the 1-0 games, the one score becomes, you can replay that 100 times, make it more interesting. Then we took that to F1 Formula race in Shanghai last year, worked with China Mobile and Nokia we can rebroadcast like every driver. F1 Formula is relatively new in China. People, yeah, it's great, it's expensive, must be great, everybody go there, but they don't understand it. So we start following the drivers, explain the rules, so they can pick a stream. July, we just did one, so we step it up a little bit, this time with one of the operators of China Unicom. We brought in Tencent, which is one of the largest cloud provider and content owners in China. And we did in the Mercedes-Benz Arena in Shanghai, it was a concert. So what we did is we take different streams. There's a 35,000 audience. Somebody's bound to sit in a really lousy seat, can't see anything. So instead of relying on just the big panel, they were able to pick and choose on different streams and on their device to see different angles of the concert. In addition, Tencent, as a cloud provider, content owner, had what their Chinese version of Kardashian sit at the arena and interpreting what he or she saw, and their fans subscribe to micro channels and getting all that information. So really becoming a way to look at a business model. Before it was just arena owners owns everything. Now through this, the operator gets to step in. Some of the content provider gets additional added value pushing out to their audience. So there's multiple ways of looking at this. Whether it's a media, within Intel really focused on a couple of verticals to try to look at different things. Industrial is definitely one. Like Schneider Electric pointed out, there's a lot of need in robotics and cloud robots in Industrial 4.0. Retail is another one. Hospitality, transportation, airline, definitely is one that we can look at. So just some examples we can have, and I think good for discussion in the panel this afternoon. Thank you very much.
So we're going to roll right into roundtable one, and we're going to run at the roundtable for at least half an hour, maybe a little bit longer. Then we really want to open it up to an open mic conversation so that you have a chance to express yourselves, please. And by the way, for those of you who do come to the mic, there's a bottle of wine for you. So roundtable members, please, as you introduce yourselves, Rob Nash-Boulden from Black & Veatch is chair. Introduce yourself by name and title, give a little bit about what it is that you do in life. And then we roll right into the conversation. So, Rob.
Hey, thank you. As you said, I'm Rob Nash-Boulden. I'm with Black & Veatch Data Centers. So we are an engineer and constructor of data center facilities around the world. How about I'll go start with you, Hugh, down on the right.
Sure. Hey, thank you. Hugh Carspeckin, DartPoints. We are a micro-edge data center operating company.
I'm Mark Bailey with Dell EMC. For the last 10 years, we've been doing modular solutions for customers, starting at the core, looking at IT solutions, and then expanding them into the infrastructure.
My name is Jeff Sharpe. I'm Director of Product Management for a company called ADLINK. Some of you may have never heard of ADLINK, but we're about in everything that you do, from telecom, military, transportation, and we're the wizard behind the curtain.
My name's Shawn Mills, and I am the CEO of a company called Greenhouse Data. We are a cloud co-location and managed services company that operates around 9 markets now around the country in many locations that you would definitely call the edge.
Well, I'm Pitt Turner, Uptime Institute co-founder, and we look at data centers in an interesting perspective, and we'll get more into that in a minute.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Joe Reele. I'm Vice President of Solution Architects here at Schneider Electric.
I'm Lance Smith. I'm with Salesforce, Senior Director of Infrastructure Engineering, focused on data center strategy, hardware strategy, capacity planning.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, everyone. And our panel is a little different. The second panel is going to talk a bit about the future, and our panel is a little more focused on the present in terms of edge. So we're going to try hard as a group not to look too far forward, which is actually harder than it sounds when we're talking about edge, but to sort of live in the present and talk about some of the architecture strategies and maybe some of the folks that are taking advantage or capitalizing on the edge presently, and try hard not to look too far forward. That way we don't steal too much of panel 2's thunder. Beginning the conversation, the edge strategy today, as opposed to, we'll try to look a little bit backwards to start, just to put that wall in front of us, how edge looks today versus, say, a few years, 5 years ago, and maybe start down here with you, Lance.
Sure, I would say 5 years ago it wasn't even thought about. It wasn't even a consideration. I don't think a lot of companies thought about customers globally and how to extend their infrastructure out to different customers. But I think over the last few years it's become, as technology has advanced, further and further consideration. A lot of the focus has been on the network and how to serve them best from that perspective, but not really thought out.
I mean, Salesforce is a cloud-born product, and edge and cloud and the interaction thereof. How do those work together today from a sort of an architecture standpoint?
Sure, as far as it's basically an extension of our data center strategy. That's how we approach it, kind of where our global presence is, how we best serve our customers, and factoring in the network and including that as part of the plan. Also understanding how our customers use our products and services and how we can kind of extend that architecture to them via edge computing, and then fully optimize the architecture and in a secure fashion to make sure our customers trust our interactions.
From a 5 years back perspective, Joe, what are your thoughts? Versus
I actually have a little bit different take, slightly. So maybe the word edge wasn't around 5 years ago, but I was SVP at Bank of America Global Data Centers. There are admin facilities, and each of those admin facilities may have a small IDF, MDF closet. And in that closet, it serves the tenants in that building. We had 2,000 associates in that building. It may not have been called edge. It's exactly what it was, okay? And so I think the term is new, but the application of putting something closer to a core group of people that are going to make that core group of people be more effective with their day-to-day job, I'm not so sure that it's brand new. I think it's always been around. We're changing the name of it. The technology's changing a little bit, but the general perception of I need to put something close to where more people are going to get beneficial use of is not something new. We're figuring out better ways to leverage it today, and I think we're figuring out technology is leading us a little bit more down the road to really kind of sort of fire that cylinder a little bit more, perhaps. Okay, a little bit different, but.
Do you think it's really defined by where the compute happens or where analytics are taking place? When you're defining it today versus the past, or you're saying you have a little bit of a different approach, how are you defining it?
I'm not sure I understand. I think.
Is the edge where the compute and analytics are happening, where the processing is happening? Is it more of a distributed cloud
Probably more of that, a little bit distributed cloud, and I think it's a hybrid. It's a little bit of this and a little bit of that, depending on what. Not everybody is in the content delivery market. Their approach to edge is going to be a little bit different, perhaps, than somebody in a retail environment, perhaps. Okay, so your core business is where it starts. Okay. And then from there, leveraging the technology that's out there to best utilize for your business is going to be a little bit different for everybody, I think. Yes?
Yeah, you know, I really think when you say, how do you define it? It will be defined by whomever is driving it. Every customer has a definition. Every enterprise or any service agency is going to define it perhaps a little differently, and we end up with a hybrid solution.
Yes, sir.
There are 3 or 4 or 5 different major components, and every enterprise or agency is going to use a different mix. So I'd like to step a little bit back. I think the 2 speakers here really have positioned us to understand that there is a huge paradigm shift going on now in our industry and has been for a couple of years. I mean, paradigms used to be something that would change generationally. You know, my parents had a different paradigm than I did. Now, I think the paradigms are shifting more, let's call it an hourly basis, maybe weekly, maybe monthly, but it's under constant revision. And so when we look at things like a data center, for example, and I've been with Uptime Institute for, I don't know, 22, 25 years, when we used to think of a data center, that was the edge of reality. You know, while that other stuff came and went to and from the data center, now the edge will be defined differently. But I think it's fair to say, with some clarification, that the data center as we knew it a couple years ago is totally dead. Now, to pick up Mark Twain's definition of dead, you know, he might be slightly exaggerating reality, but I think it is going to be owned by different people, it's going to reside in different places, it's going to be operated by different staffs, if there's a staff in the building or the enclosure at all. And I think those things are highly relevant to where the world is going. As long as there are devices that process IT and have flashing lights, there is going to be this thing called an enclosure. We used to call it a data center, but they're getting smaller. You know, I mean, we just announced a product offering last week that ranges from, I think it's 90 kW up to 1200 kW, manufactured modular micro products exactly focused on responding to that quick paradigm change that we're watching. Oh, wait a minute, it's changed since a minute ago. It's very dynamic.
Well, I think you're right. It's interesting because I think it's a very fluid reality of where the edge lives. The edge lives somewhere different for Salesforce than it does for American Airlines, where the edge is inside of that little capsule that we all zoom through the air in, and you know, there's data being cached there. And so the realities of 5 years ago, where it was great to have a data center or multiple data centers, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, one in the middle of the country, now trying to understand where cloud nodes need to be deployed, where virtual instances need to be deployed. Those edge instances are going to be in a lot different places than we probably imagined five years ago.
Are you agreeing with the distributed cloud topology? Or
well, distributed cloud, distributed information, and it's absolutely going to morph based on the use case. So, you know, Salesforce's use case is different than, you know, some other CDN provider, and so I think the distributed nature of it is going to be almost on an application or a workload by workload basis, and then up to the software developers to determine where exactly is the smartest place for this workload to live. Is it actually on your phone? Is the edge your phone? No, there's enough compute there.
Yeah, I think the focus will be on optimizing that architecture end to end.
Right.
Like where the analytics set, and you know.
And we have to be very careful with the definition. I think one of the sound bites that I love most from our speakers is a Chinese version of Kardashian. It used to be that was purely an American, North American kind of self-promotional image. But now we have a Chinese version of that. We have to go, wait a minute, what things are we assuming, evaluating in a very small framework? And we need to up the chunk size, if we will, look at it in a much broader perspective to really understand it.
Well, staying with today, and again, trying not to project too far forward, because that's the fun part. Jeff, from your perspective, and being sort of the brains behind some of that, what does that mean in terms of the compelling use cases for that today, or or how it exists today versus just a few years ago?
Gotcha. So I'm an old telecom guy. So I've been in the telecom industry for 34 years, and edge wasn't even a term as we were talking about 2 to 3 years ago. And when edge started becoming in the forefront of the telecom industry, it was all about network optimization. How can I use virtualized application and distribute them through my network to better utilize my network and optimize it? Cost me, less and provide better value to the customers. And over the past year, there's been a total transformation away from network optimization to monetization. How can I utilize my entire distributed network to make money? How can I not compete against my over-the-top subscribers, the Skypes and the killer apps that are coming out? How can the operator actually supply those services where they need edge products to do so? Latency, quality of experience, how many people have sat on their phone looking at a video and that spinning wheel and you just turn it off, I don't want to look at it. And as they're implementing 5G is going to enhance that experience for the customer. So edge computing actually enables that. It provides additional framework, it provides additional foundation for all of these great new startups that are coming out, these application companies that are going to be putting apps for us users. And I'm sitting here with 2 devices that I can run all these killer apps on. And just, a year ago, I didn't have to say, Alexa, set the timer. Alexa, turn my lights down. That's all now becoming in our DNA. And as our friend at Schneider was saying, once you have it on your device, you expect it to get better. You expect it not to go away. You expect it to continue to be enhanced. I'm going to rely on this technology on a go-forward basis, and really, data center technology is not going to go away, but edge technology is going to continue to grow because that virtualized applications are moving towards that edge to improve my experience.
Monetizing the investment is a great example. That's something that certainly is very today and of course will be a future business trend, but that is a big difference between maybe 5 years ago and today, and setting up architectures for the future, again, today.
And what I'm seeing in the telecom industry, which is so cool, is that these operators now are talking to startups. They're talking to gray box providers. They're talking to this different infrastructure to supply applications and money-making services that they can recoup their investment, not just be a pipe. The operators do not just want to be a pipe. They want to actually provide value to their customers, provide value to their business partners, and bringing in new technology at the speed of light. Not this archaic, old, telco ways of delivering product. It's getting much quicker, and edge is definitely a way of doing it. And one thing I also want to mention too, over the past 5 years, the term of edge is been changed. The location, edge used to be just at the tower. Now it's anywhere outside that data center. It's customer premise, it's backhaul, it's tower, it's in the closet, it's everywhere now, not just at the tower itself. So very, very cool. I'm excited about the future, which I can't talk about, I know. So.
No one knows. Maybe leveraging that a little bit and moving along the conversation for Mark and for Hugh with regard to that architecture, that footprint, that design that might exist, and maybe speaking a little bit to, from a physical standpoint, how folks like you see that progressing, and maybe talk about maybe what some of the clients are asking for from a product perspective or a solutions perspective.
Definitely, being at Dell EMC, we have the luxury in the modular business to kind of get a peek at the technologies that customers are going to be using a little bit before most do in the industry. And so, kind of talking a little bit about in the past, we've been doing modular solutions for companies when we didn't even know that it really was the edge. It was taking infrastructure, putting it close to them for whatever reason, whether they didn't have enough bandwidth, whether it's because they needed to do lots and lots and lots of data ingest locally. And as an architect for infrastructure, it was really interesting to be looking at traditionally how data centers were being built 2N resiliency, even N+1 to some extent, and these customers were asking us to do things very differently that at the time, 5, 6, 7 years ago, we didn't really understand. When you started really asking them about how they were using this type of gear, and specifically the software layer that was being used on it, they were able to then do at the time what was unheard of, which was decrease their infrastructure. And so for Dell, selling more IT gear, that was fine with us, but looking at it holistically, we said, how can you have a site that's off-premise, somewhere in the middle of nowhere that has no generator, minimal UPS, et cetera? And so bringing that into the current conversation, you know, some of the interesting things we're seeing now is that just more and more and more people are doing that, and those who are going to succeed are going to be the ones that figure out what others figured out quite a long time ago for different reasons in the infrastructure. And so when I look at the footprint of infrastructure at the edge, the infrastructure footprint is completely different than what it has been in the past. And others were saying, you know, the data center as we know it is dead. You know, it may not be that dramatic, but in the end, the future, at least the new builds, are going to be very different. And I, you know, from an infrastructure perspective, understanding how the customer is going to use it is so important, because that will drive how you pitch, how you build, how you design the infrastructure. Going in on an edge solution with a 2N resiliency is not going to woo anyone. Nobody is going to be paying for thousands of sites, $5, $6, even $7 a watt anymore. And so, one, the customers, their responsibility is they got to figure out how to do it better than their competitors. From the infrastructure, we got to figure out how to do it better than our competitors, and really working together with them is going to be the way to get ahead and to do it first.
Can I interrupt for just a second? I apologize. We have one roundtable member who we need to seat right in here, and it's John Major. And if he would go back and get mic'd up, we found the lavalier mic that we'd lost.
Okay, good.
So you can continue and just let him take his seat when he's mic'd up, but I apologize for the interruption.
Got it, no problem. Maybe, Hugh, maybe tagging on to what Mark started there, and again, drilling into that sizing, footprint, what are clients asking for from an edge standpoint? Maybe you could pick up and continue from Mark's discussion.
No, absolutely. So, as I mentioned, we're a micro edge data center operator. We started back in 2012. We have been working through this micro edge portion of it. And I'm not trying to coin a new term here, but what it means is, obviously, we're all talking about the edge of the network. Micro is exactly what we're talking about now, which is everything's getting much smaller, placed in locations that we haven't normally placed infrastructure. And so we have been focusing specifically on how do you create a multi-tenant environment with the typical constraints of compliance, regulations, cost. And so we've identified economies of scale that are sub 500 kilowatts, that are focusing on very small footprints. And what's happened here is, and Mark was starting to talk about this a little bit, is that this design is very, very different. We're all used to it. We all use the same terms when we're describing it, but it's being deployed in a very, very different way. My background, I was actually in the wireless world. I helped start a company that built all the cellular backhaul for all the major carriers. And we had a motto in the company, which was build the best network that your customers are willing to pay for. That's key here. You cannot overbuild this. If you think space paradox is difficult in the larger data centers, if you think that power paradox, cooling paradox, all those issues are going to get magnified out at the edge. And by the way, you might make a mistake in a large data center. You make a mistake in a micro edge data center, you've just made that mistake 1,000 times, okay, which is a lot harder to pull back. And so this is what we've been focusing on. So we've been building 100 kW increments. We're going smaller. The one thing about a micro edge site, guys, your momentum in the data center world is to get big. Everyone talks about hyperscale, they talk about density. I'm not saying it's not gonna occur. It's absolutely gonna occur. But you've also got to be prepared to shrink. This stuff is going to shrink. Yep. It's going to get optimized. The footprint's going to go down, and all of a sudden you've got to tell your investors how you're going to monetize that blank space on your floor now. Another thing also is speaking of investors and speaking of folks that are looking to get into this space, how you're carving up your capital, how you're investing, it's a completely different ballgame. Whereas they go out and they write out checks, $200 million checks, you're now doing 200 checks at $1 million each. all right, which is if you're in the private equity world, that's a problem. So these are things that we've been working on and focusing on, and some other things with regards to if you understand the wireless carriers, and by the way, the thing that everyone needs to know about the edge, and specifically the micro edge, and as we start talking about Project Volatus, it's a great Latin word that we all wish we could pronounce, but the point is, what this means to the industry is, look at the carriers, the wireless carriers. The data center world and the wireless world are on a collision. And by the way, they're not only on a collision, wireless, cellular, and data center world. It's on a collision through Ford Motor Company. It's on a collision through Allstate Insurance. It's on a collision through many different industries. And so, for example, questions to ask yourself. When was the last time that Google and Amazon shared the same PDU? Are they going to do it now? I'm not saying they won't, but are they ready? Who's going to negotiate plugging in the back of the AT&T base station? Someone probably needs to figure that out. Obviously, they are working on this. They're working on it in spades. But these are not simple questions, and these are not questions that the data center world has traditionally handled. The number one metric in the wireless world is ARPU, annual revenue per user. Google, per click. Okay, data center, it's cost per kilowatt. It's a different paradigm. And so the edge to me is where the request and the fulfillment of that request occurs at that same location. It can be in a tier 1 market, it can be in a tier N market. The point is that user is making a request and it's being fielded and flipped around right there. And what I've been saying on a couple conferences, last point here, is that as soon as the cell tower decides to hairpin on one of their antennas, that data is a brand new data set. It's what I call logistical data. So it doesn't mean that it's not ever going to make it into a core. It will. But the point being is that infrastructure that needs to go there needs to be in line with what's actually happening at that site.
Well, hello. I'm sorry I'm late to the party, and I'm awfully glad my wife is not here, because this is one of those moments when your wife just okay, got it. Anyway, my name is John Major. I'm with Page. We're architects and engineers for data centers. And I wanted to just kind of tag on to Mark's comments about the physical infrastructure as it relates to the edge from our perspective. Most of our clients are what we would call today hyperscale. But in the past few years, we're seeing another set of clients that really captures the middle and then the edge. And so at the edge, one of the things that's interesting is, of course, the scale is very small. And when you're at that small of scale, it opens up a bunch of new opportunities for where you land that data center. And so oftentimes it's because of a distributed cloud, the infrastructure doesn't have to be robust. So now we're looking at data centers in office parks or offices. So we're seeing that happening, and it also opens up new locations of the country because they want to be at the physical edge. So Oklahoma City, we have a client who is sitting on top of 8 megawatts that was previously used for an industrial building. The industrial building's gone, but there's 8 megawatts available. The building itself isn't maybe ideal for a hyper data center, but it certainly will work at the edge. So we're looking at things like that. And if you think about it, just look around you. There's so many facilities like that that are ripe for that kind of development. And then the third set that we look at is also micro data centers. Everything from a cabinet that's in a closet in a high-rise building that's serving one floor or multiple floors, or as an amenity to a developer. So they're offering kind of a distributed micro data center within their office buildings. So interesting.
It's helpful and answers some of the question about who's looking for it today. What are those compelling use cases in terms of the users that are asking for those devices that we engineer, construct, sell, and provide? So it is about the user and those that will pay money to use edge networks. How we monetize that and how much people are willing to pay. So it helps a lot in understanding who some of those maybe clients might be and what some of the compelling edge use cases might be. I haven't heard anybody say a lot about what we did in our keynotes about industry and manufacturing. A automobiles are one of the most easily understood and recognizable examples of edge. What about other industries? Who else is using that, maybe in terms of users, use cases? Shawn, do you have some different folks knocking on your door than those that have already been mentioned?
Yeah, you know, the users are really, in our business, are coming down to super creative software developers that are really looking at their applications and trying to get it closer to their end users. You know, there's all kinds of new technologies that are popping up, and of course that's the much more exciting thing to talk about that we can't talk about. But yeah, no, I think this in our world, as we've deployed, you know, cloud nodes across 9 markets, we're seeing micro cloud utilization. Ultimately, a software developer comes in and deploys 7 servers in all 9 nodes, and so that's where we're seeing some of the unique use cases that are really coming out of those creative software companies.
If I can jump in on that, I think one of the things that we learned from history, we go back when we're building other kinds of data centers, one of the most difficult challenges for the design, development, construction, operations process is what does the business require? You know, it can be this big, it can be that big, it can be this redundant, that redundant, but it all goes back to what does the business need in order to successfully deliver its product or service offerings to the marketplace. And I think that question is still highly germane, whether it's 1200 kW, 50 kW, you know, looks like this, looks like that, you know, whatever the form factor is, it really doesn't matter. We have to be careful that we address each and every end user or client base with what is it that's required for this thing to be successful. And it will be different for different folks. So we have to have a dynamic ability to respond to that kind of request and this kind of request. You know, content delivery versus transactional based, for example, they may need different things. So we have to be very careful that we define that future with the same questions that we've been asking for 20 or 30 years. The answers will be profoundly different, but the questions are still highly relevant.
It's not going to be a product. You're not going to be able to say, hey, from Dell, here's my solution for the edge. Enjoy, right? It's going to be, I can start with something, but each and every operator or user is going to have a small tweak that is fitting his or her specific business need. And that's what's different, right? Right now you can say, oh, I have a data center, I just keep repeating it over and over and over again. Now we're seeing in every single one, the tenets are relatively the same, but the actual execution implementation is a little bit different.
A couple of years ago, George Schlesman from I.O. did a presentation at the Uptime Institute Symposium. He said the last snowflake data center has been built, meaning the last highly unique structure. Well, now what we're going to do is discover that snowflakes are not unique, but there might be 10,000 of each kind.
That's right.
True. And presently, too, I don't want to rain on our parade, but you know, edge is great, but there's also some key challenges that we're seeing. One being, if you look in a data center environment, it's fairly easy to maintain. Everything is in one center. It's all managed by a certain operating system and a control system. Now you're distributing that entire environment throughout my network from Los Angeles all the way to Hong Kong. So how do I manage that? And also purchase this gear from a multitude of different vendors, Dell, ADLINK, Advantech, Inspur, big guys to smaller guys, but I want to distribute it, but I want one interface. I want one environment to manage this. And by the way, the operators are wanting all this to be open source, open architecture. So it's becoming more and more of a challenge, and you're seeing OCP, we're part of the OCP group, TIP, Etsy, all of these standards organizations trying to herd cats and say, look, we need to have a good operational environment to support edge computing so it'll make it more operational in the future. We don't want our 911 systems to go down, nor do we want our salesforce.com system to go down at the edge. We want all these different systems to go down, and I want to be able to manage it. So if you're interested in edge technology, look at things that are happening within TIP and OCP and ONAP and all of these different open architectures to manage RSD 2.1 and Redfish and all of these cool technologies. that will enable that edge. That in itself is going to be the critical aspect of the future of edge.
What you're going to see is you're going to see the data center and the IT become one.
Exactly.
And that's the exciting part. You know, the things that have always been, oh, this is the IT side, this is the infrastructure side, you know, to the points you made. I mean, that's the exciting thing we see right now. The software side of the IT, being able to have it be open sourced, and then part of the infrastructure, so that at the end of the day, the user can manage these in a consistent way. And that's the problem state that we're being asked.
Yes.
It's like the internal version of successfully operating the edge versus the customer-facing version of that. I agree, it's got to integrate, it's got to merge together. We use a phrase that's start with the end in mind. So instead of getting someplace and then figuring out what you're going to do, we need to get a mindset that we want this all to be integrated. Use whatever acronym you want, DSIM or some other magic, but we want the end state to be defined when we begin, so we don't have to redo a bunch of stuff when we get there. Of course, where there is will always be different. It'll change every week, just like our paradigm.
Well, maybe as a next step, and maybe a last thought before we leave some time for questions, Lance and Joe, maybe how do we take these application layer items, this integration of facilities and IT and dispersion of the edge, how do we add security to that conversation when we have this many disparate use cases, applications, and physical locations? And for any other panelists that would like to add a couple cents there, just how does security fit in?
I'll try to answer it. I think as part of, as we scale out, we want to create as much, I know it's a snowflake kind of aspect to it, but you want to try to create as much consistency, as much integration as possible, not only as you operate it and secure it, but just scaling out to numerous locations. So I think that'll help with, you know, creating some consistency and parameters for security and how you manage it ongoing, whether it's physical security or via software. But the key to managing it overall, I forget who mentioned it, was, you know, the interfaces and the software and managing it through that in a single consistent way. I think that will help overall with our overall security model and strategy.
Joe, what do you think, present state of edge security? Or yeah. It's the hard part, right? I mean,
I think we got a long way to go as far as all of that is concerned. I think we're learning a lot. I mean, just as we said, today it's going to change 1 minute from now. Well, as soon as it changed 1 minute from now, everybody else is trying to figure out how to cheat it, right? So security is an evolving thing. And I'm not sure we have a great answer today. I think it's a highly moment of focus for us. The whole industry, whether you're in retail or content, it doesn't matter who. If you have customer data, you're a target, and that's clearly evident today, right? So there's a lot going on with that. I don't think any of us have the right answer for that, other than there's a lot of work to be done, and there's still vulnerabilities even when we think we have it locked up.
Yep. Shawn, what do you think? PCI, HIPAA, you got all those acronyms in your daily life.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I would definitely have to agree that it is a clear focus that needs to be, you know, a concerted effort inside the industry. We have to stay focused on the security component. I mean, with the Equifaxes of the world, the healthcare breaches that have happened, it's a concern. And as we add, I mean, just like the Internet of Things, as we add millions and billions of devices to it, securing those is going to be critical ultimately.
To add here, I think it is about the data to a certain extent, and the ability to compartmentalize it and know where it should reside, customer data versus HIPAA versus those different categories, and managing it really tightly.
And the technology has to be set up where if it all is encrypted, I don't want major latency delays within my network. So, you know, those are additional challenges that are added from that security. You got bump in the wire, you got routing and encryption. But as a user, I want faster. Right, sure. At my fingertips.
Yeah. Bruce?
So as we begin to evolve into the open mic and Q&A, I've got a couple of questions from streaming online. By the way, there's an audience about double the size that's in the room out there in the ether somewhere. And I think they're real people, and I don't think there are any trolls. So the first question, if I might, this is to whoever wants to take it. Given the miniaturization of edge applications, not quite sure what that means, but somebody here is brighter than I am. How would cooling evolve to manage the concentrated heat load? Who wants to take a
Any heat
cooling
loads, what do you
question?
think?
I
Hugh or Mark?
can take some of that. Hugh,
Seems up your alley.
You can compliment to it. You know, the thing that we all need to remember is that the IT gear that's been designed over the last 10 years is perfectly acceptable, operating well above what most of us operate our data centers at. You know, at Dell and others, HP, Lenovo, you know, the ambient conditions for temperature and humidity that most IT gear can accommodate is much higher. And so I think broadly answering the question, I think that there's a lot of meat that's still on the bone in our existing data centers that we're going to apply to the edge. I think you're going to see a lot of really innovative ways of doing cooling that are not using mechanical solutions. And I'll let Hugh capture onto that.
Sure, no problem. So we've been playing around with this for a couple of years. We're actually working on some new types of techniques. What's interesting is the problem does get a lot more concentrated in a smaller environment. There's some gotchas there. The good thing is you can't forget that it is a smaller environment. So what opens it up is the larger data center world so focused on the active cooling techniques. There's a lot of passive cooling techniques that can enter in. Mark brought up a very good point, which is, guys, let's get out of the 68 to 72 mindset. You can operate with a lot more leniency and making sure that you're just not allowing that heat to get away from you is key. And also, when you're not dealing with a megawatt in a room, you can handle 50 kilowatts. Now, it can get pretty darn hot, but the point being is there's other ways that you can get rid of it. And I'm saying this tongue-in-cheekly, but go open the door. And all of a sudden, you can drop down.
35C with a 25 to 30 degree delta T is not anything that we shouldn't be doing right now.
Yeah.
Right, and so to your point, I mean, we operate data centers. We have over 150 megawatts that's been operating for the last 10 years. 100% outside air with 35 degree inlet, up to 60% RH without issue. And so the point is the IT manufacturers are answering the customer's call to change their gear. And as a data center operator, we need to be reciprocating that and taking advantage of it because that's what's going to differentiate us from our competitors. Right?
And I think one of the things that happens is the marketplace operations people are hesitant to go there because they came up in this paradigm and now we're in that paradigm. And I think the first thing we need to do is realize there are technology solutions out there for these. Whether or not they get implemented by local management is the challenge.
Sure.
It's a management issue, it's not a technology issue. We have and are developing more solutions for those things, but whether or not they get implemented is a whole different question. So it's not this panel necessarily that has the answers, it's management's ability to change their operating practices and implement more common industry standards.
We worked with Intel on a device that you put at the edge. It's IP65. It's fanless. It goes minus 25 all the way to plus 55 on up. Fanless and ready to go. And what that does, and that's for the edge, so we started off there, but the cool thing about edge technologies is now the military is looking at it, and other different areas are looking at these technologies, so you continue to push the edge in regards to cooling at the edge. So
I'll add one more thing quickly to that is many data center providers are approaching this from a big box mindset. You can't forget that these smaller boxes, there's things that you can change on the fly. So when you go in and realize that you're having a little bit of a technological change here, you can literally remove and deploy a new type of cooling system if you need to. And playing around with this and understanding and rewriting your processes, it's a completely different, if you're going from the top down, you're gonna miss a lot. And what we've been focusing on, you've gotta go from the bottom up and realize exactly kind of how you're gonna approach this.
John Major?
Yeah, well, the other side of the miniaturization and working at very small kW would be with the Internet of Things driving density up at the edge. What do you do when you need 150 kW at the edge, or maybe 300 or larger? And we're currently working on a project with 3M. It's a passive two-phase liquid immersion cooling that's in a tank, and each tank can handle up to 150 megawatts. And it's basically an enclosed portable device that could easily be deployed at the edge.
And another question from online is, how much of data is stored at the edge at the node? What's the order of magnitude? So I think they're talking about the future. Tens of terabytes, hundreds, petabytes? So what's going to happen in storage at the edge?
It does seem like data curation at the edge is going to be important, right? There's a lot of data that's going to be generated, a lot of analytics that will occur. If we're talking about distributed cloud and cloud storage in remote places, it's one thing, but data curation at the device level or at the true edge, where the analytics are happening, only a little bit of that data is going to be able to phone home to the cloud. It's going to have to, I think, stay where it lives,
in real time.
age in place to some extent, and only the most important data will be able to physically be transmitted back to cloud, and only the data that's important or actionable data will go back to cloud for further analysis.
Excellent, excellent. So we are going to open this up to open mic, please. So the mic is there. We're supposed to have one over here, but we apparently didn't communicate effectively. So please take to the mics. Let's get this going. You all have opinions, I know. We've had a great diversity of comments here from this roundtable, so I think it gives us plenty of opportunity.
First question.
Please state your name, title, where you're from, please.
First question before that is, what kind of wine?
We're getting in the first bottle split between red and white, and we're not telling you the kind.
Does that make a rosé?
Yeah, as long as you don't mix it, that's okay.
Dave goes and sits back down.
Dave Leonard, Chief Data Center Officer for VioWest, just merging with Peak 10 as we speak now. Question in regards to the data. The data explosion has been driven by people watching things and very, very rich data, very, very big data being moved around. All the machine data we're talking about is very, very small data, although lots of very, very small data. Question to the panel is, do you see that the machine data actually becomes important or relevant compared to very big, very small number relative cat videos?
My answer to that is yes. Predictive analytics, all of that kind of thing is really going to be pertinent, Dave, on the machine data, okay? Without that data, the accuracy of predictive analytics and et cetera, so on, is not going to be very good. So that machine data, like you said, very small, but that's giant, is, in my opinion, one of the most important things on getting predictive analytics correct. And so I feel it's a vital component of the next step. And the challenge is to get all that disparate data from 15,000 different systems, okay, to be able to be collated and then made sense of, okay? So that's the most important data, is the machine data that you're talking about. And I think we're going to be at a stopping point if we can't figure out how to leverage that data to mature our analytics model. That's my opinion.
I mean, Dave, there's things out there like Apache Spark that will take machine data to machine data and actionable items without ever writing to disk. So it input, output,
right, where does the
no
edge,
storage.
Where is the edge, right? Like,
right.
So is that machine language or that machine data living on the machine and only sending some data back that then needs to be triangulated and then pushed back up? So again, the interesting thing about this conversation is the edge completely depends on the use case.
That's exactly right. One thing also is we're about to see brand new data creation. So we've been talking about autonomous driving cars, and you take a look at that. Have you thought about how the insurance industry's starting to look at that and what they're going to do? What about Department of Homeland Security with regards to driving cars? What about DOT, Department of Transportation? And so we're talking, if you talk about streaming video and how it's centrally located and it's getting pushed out, that content delivery networks, and that's fine. These cars are going to be generating just as much on the opposite side of the cellular antenna. And everyone in this room should be thinking about what that is going to do to this infrastructure.
The car is a data center.
That's exactly
Well, and the airline industry's been doing it forever, right?
That's right.
So, I mean, it's taken similar data, really taking it and using it for the highest value, which is protecting our lives, I could argue. And so it's certainly not an unknown paradigm, right? And so it'll be interesting to see how it gets implemented throughout other industries.
Yeah, Bob Sullivan, eminent educator. That's about it these days. First of all, going back to history, I have dealt with a number of insurance agencies, and the local insurance agency has a small business computer, and they do all their work during the day on that computer. And when they go home, that computer connects with the home office and uploads the summary. And then, of course, downloads any information that the home office. So, I mean, that's been going on for years. The other comment is as far as driving to higher, a wider range of environmental limits, especially as the smaller the data center gets, the drive for efficiency is going to be, they don't want to spend money operating the thing. And one of the ways that's going to happen is allow it to operate in an office, and it might be cooled 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, but it's going to have to survive the other times. Now I have a question, and that is, I'm thinking of a Colo provider that is a hosting Colo system, and they have many customers in a sort of an ideal situation for a micro edge computing facility. Are users going to allow their micro edge to be integrated in the same cabinets, in the same servers, in the same storage as others?
I can answer a little bit of that. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So ultimately, yes, but it's going to take a little bit of time. It took the wireless carriers, I don't know how many years, to actually start sharing the same antennas. And so, and we think that they're competitive. You wait till you start putting Facebook and Google and Amazon into the same rack, same server. I do think that the efficiency, one of your comments about hyper efficiency, it's amazing how many dollars you'll find when you're looking for pennies on the ground. It's so when we are, you go in, you have to keep all your costs low. You have to create a cost point that is attractive for a hyper deployment, if you will, for distributed nature. When you are, what we are going to see, and I know we can't talk too much in the future, but you're going to have a lot of these players feeling their way out, and they're all going to want their own cabinet, their own bifurcation, okay? But they are going to start figuring out, and one of the comments here on the panel here is that completely different use cases. Completely. IoT, they're going to share everything. They have to. I mean, I was working with one of the major IoT guys, and they called me up and they said, Hugh, we are going to be your best customer. And I was like, well, I'm always open for that. He wanted 10,000 locations. I was like, that's fantastic. Do you know how much it cost for me to build those 10,000 locations? And all he wanted was $120 a month. Okay, that's what he wanted to pay. Okay, so the problem was, I can't do that for that. All right, but if you go get 10,000 of your buddies at each one of the 10,000 locations, then I think we can talk. But so the point is that yes, I think they will start getting there, but there are a couple more steps that are going to have to happen, and obviously we're coordinating with a lot of them on this. But it's ultimately they want to get there.
Okay, if I'm allowed one from DCD, I'm Peter Judge, editor at DCD, and I guess because I'm at DCD, I probably don't get the wine, do I?
Later.
To a question, as you said, Rob, it's very difficult to keep this to the present instead of the future, and I've lost count of the number of times people have just slid into saying, what will happen, how will it happen? And I've been trying to think, what's the issue now? And it seems to be, in one way or another, or in many different ways, people and ideas and accepting how things are going how things are going. So, we already can do higher temperatures, but we're not because we're not ready. And we also, and we're used to having to manage data centers with people, and now we're stepping very quickly into a situation where we've got a lot of them, and they're going to be in places where there are no people to integrate to manage them. So I guess following that into one question that could be worth looking at is, at the moment now, is the technology ready to make all these little edge micro data centers properly autonomous? Or are we going to start seeing what the shortcomings are with the management technologies that are supposed to be doing that already? Does that make sense as a question, or have I?
So.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
What
makes
if
a
I
lot
give
of
you the
sense.
answer both? Does that make sense?
Yep, do.
Yeah, I think we have the technology today to do a lot of the things. I think, do we know it all? We don't. I think we're going to learn a lot of things as that happens. But I think my colleagues up here said something really important. I think it's really worth hammering home. Our behaviors typically in the industry are driven by our clients, correct? So if the client walks in and goes, I want it 72 degrees, the data center operator is going to put it 72 degrees. It's always been like that, always will be. Right? So we need more people to embrace a little bit. Things are different today. So as the world understands those differences and are willing to do things differently, then of course the industry then changes. It's a people industry, believe it or not, that makes the data center industry. People don't realize that. They think it's just ones and zeros. But it's the people behaviors that have shaped the data center industry a lot of times. We didn't want to fail, so we built 2 ends of things. And we didn't like that, so we built it 72 hours with the fuel because we don't like. So it's the people that's driving the industry, right? As people start to accept a little bit different change and realize the technology today, and we've done that. John Major mentioned, we were once building at 2N, and now we're building at N+1, and the same people are really happy about that. Right? That's because technology's taken over a little bit of where infrastructure handled the reason, and as people understood that, they then accepted that, and as that became accepted, that became more of what we do as an industry. Nobody builds at 2 parents N+1 anymore, I don't think.
No, and I think we have an ownership in helping the transformation for customers.
Correct.
So you mentioned the Facebooks, the Googles. There's a whole bunch of other customers that have a lot of edge infrastructure that are doing things the old ways. And some of the opportunities for us is really embracing, helping own that customer transformation so that they can remain relevant going forward. As you fast forward, all these things are going to happen. It's going to be who's going to help who get there first. Those are who the people who are going to be successful. And so from the infrastructure side, we have a role to play. The customer, at the end of the day, also has a huge role to play. Those that get there first and can evolve without being left behind, honestly, they're the ones who are going to succeed. And from an infrastructure perspective, we need to be ready to support both.
If I could jump in really quickly, I don't think technology is the issue at all. I don't see that as the constraint. I see it as the fluidity of the market, the really nailing your use cases. Each customer, each provider of whatever services really understand the value prop and how they can implement it for themselves and really maximize their benefits and profits out of that.
And part of that is going to be a discussion around resiliency. What happens when this particular piece of the edge goes away? Does the customer service disappear? Does it get degraded? Is it transparent? I mean, those are all part of that definition of what that customer's use case is, the service provider's use case. And until we have the answers to what their need is, we don't have a defined solution for that. Or if we do, we're not paying attention.
I think it's interesting that the entire enterprise community is sprinting to a centralized cloud. And here we are talking about how to benefit from the edge. I mean, right now there's mandates or proclamations from very large organizations that I'm going to be sitting in the Amazon cloud in 2020. And then, it's that ebb and flow of the realities of the enterprise and the deployment strategy of right now, most enterprises are literally sprinting to the cloud as fast as they can. And guess what that strategy is? It's a very centralized strategy.
And one of the things that's really fascinating when we talk to people, they say, oh, we've decided to take the risk of putting our applications in the cloud. And go, really, can you share with me what the analysis of that risk was? And they go, yes, we've decided to take the risk. You know, it's like there's no analysis. That's what's happening, so we'd better get on the bandwagon too. And our content director, Matt Stansberry, did a little bit of research on somebody out there who reports on disruptions in the cloud. And there was one particular service provider in the first 7 months had 23 public environment declarations of failure, slowing down. So to move out there, it reminds me when people used to move in the early days to a third-party service provider. Well, that's their only business. They must know it really well, so they can do it better than we do. And some of that stuff in the 90s was pretty schlocky, to be real blunt. But there was a customer mindset, an enterprise mindset. If that's all they do, they must do it better than we do it. So we're going to take the risk. No analysis, just we're going to do it. So the same thing sounds like it's happening in the cloud. There are really good cloud providers also, but you know, there needs to be a use case and a risk analysis, and accept what it is you're buying. Don't be surprised.
Peter, I think I would say maybe we're not there today. I see edge as device to device, and I don't think our infrastructure can support that today. I think what we're talking about is distributed cloud. When we answer those other questions, true edge, device to device, real-time analytics and decision making, and data curation. There's no way 4G networks handle it. It's yet to come. The security provisions that go around it, the ways that data will be curated, I'd say, you know, just as a kind of a fun counterpoint, that potentially we're not there yet.
We may be there or we may not be there, but it's kind of like a cliff edge that people have to. That's what kind of edge this might be. That people have to jump off, a cliff edge. Whereas central cloud is now a bandwagon that's a done deal, and you have to catch up with it. This is something that's coming at us in a much more sort of scary way on the human level.
Well, I think it's important too to understand what the broad marketplace is doing in general. It's inertia versus the leading innovators. It's kind of like no one's talked here about the autonomous Formula One vehicles yet. But if we talk about autonomous cars, well, it's only a logical extension. All the F1 cars are going to be driven by machines pretty soon. Well, what's the point in that? I mean, that's an engineering challenge, no longer a human element. So we have to be careful that while we're talking about that future, we don't get so carried away in the future that we assume that, well, because one person did it, all 12 billion end users or all 12 billion enterprises are going to have it all done by tomorrow. Right. It's not going to happen. So there's an application process that takes place that takes time. You know, and we can talk about the right thing in the future, but let's not forget we have a very lethargic, sometimes not dynamic moving entity called the middle of the market that it's going to take probably not years, but careers before it gets there.
And think of edge too as a evolving technology too, because I think we've all said, I think every one of us said it's use case driven. So edge is there, the technology, we can hit a lot of the technology requirements that are out there, but it's really about the use case. And that's going to drive it. And I don't think edge competes with data center because they all both have their use case centric environments. Edge,
absolutely true.
Like virtualized radio access networks for the telcos. That should be at the edge, not in the cloud because of latency. However, maybe managing analytical static data up in the cloud is more useful because you don't need those latencies. But it's all about the use case. I think all of us walk away, and as these use cases explode with IoT, autonomous vehicles, and everything else, video transfer, media, the Chinese Kardashians, I'm gonna have to start using that from Caroline, but it's all driven by the use cases.
So Peter, you got a follow-up?
I'm happy. I think we want some questions from people we can
Absolutely.
give wine to. We need to get rid
There
of
should
some
be
wine.
a line behind you right now. I do not understand this. Frankly, I'm disappointed. There we go.
Hi, Jennifer Whitty with Verizon Cloud Platform. So I really lean to what you guys were saying before, that it really is a cultural change, right? And what he said, that it's the use cases ending. But can you guys speak to a little bit on the side of what are you all doing? So I've got 45 locations around the globe that I manage, right? And each one has a unique set of circumstances of what people are willing to do, what I'm allowed to ask them to do, what I'm allowed to implement, right, from a automating standpoint. What have you guys done internally to your companies to help the organization get ready for what the technology can do? Or I'll just take my wine and go.
Well, if you think about it being user or use case driven, you're reacting. You're vetting ideas. If a group of engineers come to you and say, we'd really like to try this new particular software or this new solution to a problem.
Yeah.
The first thing you do isn't go out and buy 100,000 licenses for it and deploy it company-wide. You have focus groups. You test it and vet it. Is it really a solution? Are we looking at the real problem? Are we looking at a base case kind of scenario where this is something that technology fixes, or is this just kind of a nice to have? We have to react to what the use cases are and what the users are bringing. There is no one size fits all for that.
Well, I'm not sure that the software developers are even thinking about it right now, really. You know, I think some of them are starting to think down the path of, all right, what does it mean to throw 10,000 endpoints out there? Oh, well, how could I deal with that? And so I think it's such the infancy that a lot of these enterprises are still not thinking that this is an option and that is a potential use case because they're kind of, as I mentioned, sprinting in the opposite direction right now.
So I'll give you a good example of where a customer of ours wants to use converged and composable infrastructure across their, call it a variety of deployment locations, some including NEBs, some including central offices, et cetera. And so, you know, from an IT provider standpoint, you know, we look at a stack of racks and we say we need to ship these racks to 5 different locations. Well, I think what you're getting at, every one of those locations has different requirements, whether it be use case or specifically regulatory around NEBs, right? And so, not to get into the whole of that, but you know, you look, I mentioned earlier, there's a whole lot of companies that have a huge footprint of real estate and capacity that are already existing very close to the end user. And so one of our challenges is how do we enable the use of hyperscale or converged infrastructure in those deployment locations where in which traditionally they would be bound by regulatory requirements. And so that's part of it, is working with the customer to understand their usage and their utilization of that gear. Some things are life safety that cannot be changed, but we've been working with them to try and figure out how to manage that, and we've been very successful. So the existing telco market has a lot of legacy infrastructure that is an opportunity, if looked at correctly, that must be evolved in order to be competitive against emerging companies such as Google and others.
Oh, that's perfect. Well, that's what our 45 locations go to 10,045 next year, right?
That's right.
So
A good problem to have.
that's right. Like I'm in good shoes at this point, but but that's really it's a company question, like you just said, about are you ready to change? Because if we do this the same way and it takes me 9 months to get into each one of those locations,
that's right,
and another year and a half to get those particular people working at that location up to speed to say, no, the box will tell you when it has a problem.
And if
right?
you're,
you don't need to go there.
And if your 6 kilowatt cabinet costs you $50,000 per cabinet to execute in that location, as opposed to, again, as I mentioned, helping the transformation of the customer to look at now maybe it's a 12, 15, 20 kilowatt cabinet that with thinking about things differently, how is it being used? Now the burden may be $2,000 to $3,000 in order to enable that rack. You start looking at it at scale across multiple locations, hundreds if not thousands of locations for some customers. That's real money, and that's what we've been asked to be working on.
And we have some of the same problems as Verizon, because you have Verizon Wireless and you have Verizon Business. They're kind of starting to converge, and our company as well, because a lot of our technologies that we're working with Verizon on has to meet CPE. It has to go in the customer's premise, or it goes in the central office, or it goes in a cabinet. And Verizon saying, hey, I would like to have one common platform, and oh, by the way, plug and playable, that I can put a Dell's storage device in or a Metronome device in. It has to be open architected. So for me, my telecom vertical, I have to talk to our IoT guys and say, hey, do we have a small device that can plug go the military guys? Do we have something hardened that can actually go outside? So it actually helps us with a lot of your requirements to look inside of our company and how do we deliver a common solution to Verizon Wireless, Verizon Comms, Verizon Business, and everything. So it's a challenge.
I'll throw 2 cents on this as well as it's a completely different way to view this. And Mark was hinting at this. When you look around, so for example, we engage a lot of the hospital groups. We're dealing with one that's got like 79 sites, nearly 100 sites. And so when you're approaching that, it's a completely different algorithm that you go about. You have to look at the environment. You have to take a look at what's existing. There's a lot of waste out there, a ton of waste. And if you can leverage that and use it, you can drop your deployment costs way down, and also you'll drop your operating costs, because we all know that if you go make a wrong turn on your capital, your operating is going to shoot through the roof. And again, when you've made that mistake in one location and then 1,000 locations, that's a really expensive mistake. And so taking a look at that and deploying it. So the company who wants to do that, when we engage those types of companies, you have to drive immediately to their processes. How do they think? How do they do this? And then start adapting that towards that. And the good thing about the micro edge is that when you do realize that you're kind of going down the wrong road, you can always back up one step and then turn. And so you really want to, you can capture a lot of mistakes. So anybody who comes and say, hey, we're going to do this in all 48 locations, it's rarely the case.
Thank you.
So I have a question while the next person is rushing up to the mic, right? We're now, somebody said it in a different way, we're in a workload-centric, application-centric, and not infrastructure-centric world now. We're driven by what the customer demand is. We're driven by the user experience more and more, and Salesforce certainly is an example of that. So my question is that in the world, in the time of DevOps really ought to be DevOps and the chief digital officer. And sometimes that may be the chief technology officer, but many times it's not going to be. It's going to be a whole new cat who sits in that chair. So my question is anybody here yet feeling any pressure coming from the world of DevOps and the chief digital officer?
I've always found the digital officers are kind of a 0 or a 1. They're never in the middle.
Thank you, Pitt. Deeply appreciated.
Absolutely. Try to contribute, Bruce.
But in the era of digital transformation, that's where we are, right? DevOps is the people who are developing for mobile apps. We're moving to the small screen as fast as we can possibly get there. We're moving away from the laptop even. We're moving to the pad and the mobile device. That's where most of the data is going to be generated, whether it's cat videos or your airline reservations. Is anybody yet, from the standpoint of the edge data center, feeling that coming from a different place within the enterprise? Or is it still coming from the CIO and IT?
We're seeing it. Working with some partners that are driving out the next gen, if you will, of the network, that are engaging with, so essentially, as we see the data center market go from the tier 1 to the tier 2 and then so on and so forth. And keep in mind, guys, that as the 5G towers, and I'm talking wireless right now, but they're going to be big deal towers in the tier 1. Keep in mind that when you're on I-20, those are still pretty big deal towers. And so we are seeing folks that are developing applications that are being pushed into interconnection sites that are deeper and deeper and deeper into the market. They are not at the cell tower yet, okay? But they are moving, and we're starting to see how they are scaling down a lot of the footprint, doing more with less, and in preparation for a different type of customer base, a customer base that hasn't quite had that yet. One of the things that we're seeing is the gaming industry. We're seeing a lot in there, where you can have someone out in the middle of nowhere, literally in the boondocks, that is looking for a very different type of experience because he's a competitive gamer. And I didn't really know this, but they're making quite a bit of money now And these guys are competitive. And so there's a push here. So we're seeing a lot of development in those types of applications to be able to bring tier one market capabilities and competitiveness to an area that has traditionally been underserved.
So an area right now that is exploding around us, but it's basically a very naive and juvenile area, is cryptocurrency. But the number of ICOs that is happening and the valuation of those ICOs is exploding. And that would seem to be a natural edge application. It's probably the fastest growing segment of the industry today, right? From a valuation standpoint. Does anybody see that currently as having any impact at the edge?
I'll answer again. I have a customer that's in that business. I wouldn't necessarily call it edge. I am seeing it where they place their stuff is where they place their stuff. They don't really necessarily care. If anyone has seen a cryptocurrency server farm, it is not what you think it is in some cases. In other ways, it's hyper cool, but pardon the pun. But they're located in areas. They're very cost conscious in some cases. So they wouldn't be in centralized data centers. I am seeing them in maybe an edge and offsite. I haven't seen them necessarily move out. They're very power intensive, and so they do kind of stay close to the grid. But we are starting to develop kind of as they spawn out from one location to another. We're following them and helping them as they try to interact with the exchanges.
So Rob, as you begin a summation here, one of the things that I would like to hear from each person is what it is that they consider to be the relevant technology sets at what level of capacity and development today. So again, the online questions are just like the panel. It's hard to stay in today and not project right to the next step. But what are the network topologies? What do they look like? What's the requirement? What's the requirement at the server and rack level? So things like that. So if there's anything that helps us define what it is that we mean by edge today, that's what I'm looking for as a kind of a summation.
By virtue of size, by virtue of network topology, yes, okay.
Storage requirement, CPU requirement.
We did talk a little bit about footprint and size and location. We didn't talk a lot about some of the finer nuances of that in the present, just because it may be very client specific. But with that, maybe we will go down the panel here and just do a final thoughts with regard to that. How about you, John? You want to kick us off?
Yeah, I was just wondering if we're going to get to a point where we'll have multiple definitions for the edge. I know we're all saying it is not one thing, but I think we need an infrastructure definition that defines the size and the physical requirements and infrastructure, and then something else for the applications that run in it and all of the other things that come up. So just to focus on the infrastructure thing, to me, this is, for the edge, it's sub 1 megawatt in terms of size. That's just my personal observation. I don't know if it's been defined by anyone else, but that's kind of where I see it. And I think it's also defined by looking at alternate types of locations, both in terms of energy cost, infrastructure that's available, and the physical infrastructure, the building that it's housed in. That's how I kind of define it.
Hugh, you want to go down and say the opening bid is a megawatt for size?
Yeah.
Location could be sand on the beach. It could be anywhere. What do you think?
Well, we do not build anything larger than 300 kilowatts. And that's where we found economies of scale, where we can build a very inexpensive per kilowatt. When looking at the infrastructure, it's bounced around here a little bit. Again, I build in 100 kilowatt chunks. I can build this in many different ways. I'm just now starting to explore different types of architecture to do this. Sometimes I build in commercial properties. Sometimes I put them out in parking lots. But I stay disciplined on that per kilowatt. one thing we haven't been talking about is standardization, and that's what we've been working on. We've got a standardized process how to deploy these, and so that's what we focused on. And that process is centers around where you build that infrastructure. That application, as we've mentioned, is going to drive that infrastructure, okay? And you need to be flexible with the fact that they might have it might be slightly different than what you were thinking about. And so understanding that there is a hierarchy of data. For example, a lot of people, the wireless industry, the cellular coverage, it's redundant. So you don't necessarily need to put all that out at the cell tower. It's kind of a waste of capital. So the idea here is you're going to have in my world, I'll have a core micro edge, and then I'll have kind of a smaller core edge micro edge, and then I'll have kind of a cellular tower Insight edge. I mean, I'm just making these terms up, but it's
distributed edge.
You're going to have a very different definition, and you're going to come up with those designs and then stick to those designs, and then you'll find that I'm an engineer, so that integral, that T to 0 kind of numbers, how close you can bring in that integral is going to allow you the most flexibility at the edge.
So we have customers that the edge to them is many different things, even in the same location. So a 1 RU system that's consuming 2 kilowatts, that's an edge for one specific location within a city. The one that may be 2 miles away could be 100 kW, and something that could be another 10 miles away could be a megawatt. And so to us, it really is something that's scalable. The question around, what are the C-level guys care about? At the end of the day, infrastructure is a necessary evil. And so the most exciting thing that we see right now that's transforming the industry is going to a software level of resiliency. You look at the edge, they're not, as I said earlier, they're not going to be spending $5, $10 per watt anymore. And so the software resiliency is going to allow them to do that. So some of the things Hugh was talking about, so the exciting thing going forward is I think the edge is flexible. It's varying kW amounts, customer dependent, but the software resiliency that is going to allow for multitude of these different sites to fail over to one another geographically and allow the infrastructure to be the minimum it can be for a specific application, I think is where I see the exciting thing coming forward. And Owen's supposed to talk about that.
Your product set certainly supports it from a rack unit to a megawatt. It's a big range, and certainly you're well positioned to answer the client demands across that spectrum.
So same thing for us, same in line with Dell, as we see it as an extra small to an extra large form factor. It depends on, again, the use case. How we see the edge is a good example is a virtual CP device that you would put at a customer's premise. It could be as small as your pad, but powerful with Xeon processors in it, all the way to an OCP type rack or an open rack type of environment. I think the challenge that we're seeing around this, and I'll bring this back up again, is in the standards. Standards is kind of becoming a 4-letter word. We want open architecture, but we want everything to work together. And it's around software to me. It's how do I take that extra small device all the way to the extra large device and use the same kind of common infrastructure software to be able to virtualize it, manage it, upgrade it, and add additional, in a secure way, add additional applications to that. And do that on a scalable from an Atom Intel processor all the way up to a Xeon or even a NVIDIA AI type processor. But that infrastructure in between that has to be fairly common. And that's the challenge that we're seeing through standards organizations. ETSI, 3GPP just started talking about edge computing in their latest 5G spec. So it's starting to be heavily recognized that we need some type of common infrastructure to manage it. Hardware, again, I think we can all manage that from a supplier perspective. It's just how do we manage it, control it, make it secure, and make it available for everyone.
I'll probably take just a slightly different thought process around the edge and what's required there, and take the network approach to it. Most of our data, half of our data centers are in definitely edge-like locations: Bellingham, Washington, Cheyenne, Wyoming, and so, and then out in the boondocks in New York. But when telecom carriers are moving into your facility to service their customers and the needs, that's when we really felt the edge come. And I'm wondering the connection between the edge and number of carriers that are moving into that location specifically, and how that ultimately plays out into the, is this an edge location now, and how important is the telecom redundancy of that location? So that's one of my thoughts around that.
Well, I think a uniform process is lovely, but it all drives around what are the customer and the business requirements. You know, no applications are the same, no definitions of edge are the same, and our process has to be able to support that dynamic change of paradigm and the mix of business uses, whatever it is. If we can't support all of that dynamic, then we as an industry have failed.
I'll probably throw you off for a loop here. I don't think edge is a location or size. I'll give you an example. Chris Crosby, Compass, built a data center in Minneapolis. If Bank of America took over that data center, that's a regional data center for Bank of America, correct? But if it goes to Apple and Facebook and Google, content providers, carriers, storage, how the data center is used becomes. So edge is application, folks, not a location, and it's not relative on size. All right, I disagree with, not to disagree with everybody up here, but that's my opinion. Edge is an application, not dependent on location and not dependent on size, how you use it, okay? So little different answer than everybody up here. But if the true definition of edge is really the technology within it and how it's utilized, simple as that. The same data center in the same location, if it's Bank of America, it's an enterprise data center. If it's other people that are doing other things, all of a sudden it's edge. So is it location or size? And the answer is no, it wasn't either of those.
Yeah, so maybe there's no edge without cloud, right? The two have to coexist. It's difficult for us to differentiate between that, what's a distributed cloud and what's edge. And so point well taken. That's some final thoughts.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with both. So yeah, in my experience, edge is sub 1 megawatt probably. The hardware that's out there today, servers could support what we need to do at the edge. The network, if you have the right locations and configuration, should support it. But I really think the pressure is on the software resiliency, the application teams to really exploit how they use the edge and best serve their customers. That's really where I think the focus is going to be.
So this is a great way to end this August panel. I thank you all. What I learned from this is we don't know what the edge is. We don't know where it is. We don't know how big it is, but we've eaten up an hour and a half of great time with great conversation. So thank you very much. So we'll break for 30 minutes for chat, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the future of what we don't know.